At first glance, it seemed like nothing more than a formal portrait of a plantation mistress with her servant until experts uncovered a forbidden truth. Dr. Sarah Mitchell stood at the loading bay of the National Archives in Washington, D.C. on an unusually chilly Tuesday morning in March 2024. She had spent 12 years as curator of the Civil War photographic collection. Over that time, she had processed hundreds of donations, daguerreotypes, ambrotypes, cartes de visite, each one offering a small window into America's most fractured era. But something about this package felt different right away. The box was compact, neatly wrapped in brown paper, bearing only her name and the archive's address in clean block letters. No phone number, no email. Inside, there was a short typewritten note. It read, "Dr. Mitchell, this photograph has been in my possession for 3 decades. I acquired it from an estate sale in Charleston, South Carolina. I suspect it may hold historical importance, but I wish to remain anonymous. Please study it closely. Some things are not as they seem. The truth matters more than my name." Sarah felt the familiar tug of curiosity. Anonymous donations weren't common, but they weren't unheard of either. Sometimes people inherited items with difficult pasts and wanted them properly preserved without personal entanglement. She gently lifted the photo from its protective sleeve. It was a carte de visite, small-mounted print popular during the Civil War era, about the size of a modern business card. For its age, it was in remarkable condition. The image showed 2 individuals posed in a formal studio setting with a painted backdrop of classical columns and flowing drapes. On the left stood a white woman, roughly 28 to 30 years old. She wore an elaborate silk gown with a wide hoop skirt, a fitted bodice, and a delicate lace collar, typical attire for wealthy Southern women in the early 1860s. Her hair was styled in the period fashion, parted in the middle and smoothly pulled back. She stood with confident poise, one hand resting on an ornate side table, her expression serene and composed. Her clothing and bearing spoke of wealth, status, and the easy authority of someone used to command. On the right stood a black woman, noticeably younger, perhaps 22 to 24. She wore a simple but well-made dark dress with a plain white collar. A white head wrap covered her hair, which was standard for enslaved domestic workers. Her hands were clasped in front of her, her posture upright but with shoulders slightly curved inward. Her expression was carefully neutral, her eyes cast slightly downward in the submissive manner expected of enslaved people photographed alongside their enslavers. The composition was typical for Civil War-era photos meant to depict a benevolent relationship between enslaver and enslaved, propaganda images designed to justify slavery as a paternalistic system where enslaved people were supposedly well cared for in content. Sarah had seen dozens of similar photographs. They always unsettled her visual records of oppression staged to look like harmony. She turned the photo over. On the back, written in faded ink, was a notation. Caroline Ashford and her girl Rachel, Charleston, South Carolina, March 1863. Just those few words. No last name for Rachel. No clarification of the relationship beyond the possessive her girl. Standard for the period. Enslaved people were rarely granted the dignity of full names or identities in official records. Sarah placed the photograph on her examination table under proper archival lighting and reached for her loupe. Something about the anonymous note troubled her. Some things are not what they appear. What had the donor seen that prompted such a cryptic warning? She began her standard examination, checking for damage, alterations, or unusual details. The photo appeared authentic, correct paper stock, mounting style, and printing technique for 1963. No obvious signs of manipulation or forgery. But as Sarah studied the faces more closely through her magnifying loupe, something began to gnaw at her professional instincts. She couldn't yet name it, but it made her lean in closer, her pulse quickening with that familiar sensation, a significant discovery waiting to surface. She picked up her phone and called her colleague, Dr. James Warren, a specialist in forensic analysis of historical photographs. "James, can you come to my office? I need a second opinion on something." "Give me 10 minutes, he replied. Sarah returned her attention to the 2 faces separated by the brutal hierarchy of 1863 Charleston. Caroline Ashford, plantation mistress, and Rachel, whose last name had been deemed unworthy of recording. But something about those faces was beginning to disturb Sarah in ways she couldn't yet articulate. She reached for her digital scanner, knowing she needed to examine this image at far higher resolution than her loupe allowed. Whatever the anonymous donor had seen, Sarah was determined to find it. James arrived with his portable digital microscope and laptop, the specialized gear that had helped them authenticate and analyze countless historical photos. He was in his mid-40s, methodical and precise, with the patient demeanor of someone who understood that historical truth often reveals itself slowly, detail by detail. "What do we have?" he asked, setting up his equipment on Sarah's workstation. Sarah handed him the photo and the anonymous note. 1863 carte de visite from Charleston. Plantation mistress and her enslaved domestic worker. Standard propaganda composition for the period. But the donor specifically said to examine it carefully, that things aren't what they appear. James studied the image through Sarah's loupe first, his expression neutral and professional. Then he looked up, meeting her eyes. "Have you noticed the facial structure?" Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "I was beginning to." "Yes, but I wanted your analysis before I said anything." James connected his digital microscope to his laptop and positioned the photo under its lens. The image appeared on the screen, and he began a systematic examination at increasing magnifications, starting with the overall composition, then zeroing in on specific details. "Let's start with basic facial mapping," he said, opening specialized software used by forensic analysts. He began marking key points on Caroline Ashford's face: the distance between her eyes, the width of her nose, the angle of her cheekbones, the shape of her jaw, the positioning of her ears relative to her eyes. Then he moved to Rachel's face and marked the same points. Sarah watched as the software generated overlay comparisons. Even before the analysis was complete, the similarities were becoming undeniable. "The interocular distance is nearly identical," James said quietly, his voice taking on the focused intensity he always had when making a significant discovery. "Same ratio of face width to face length, nearly identical cheekbone structure. Look at the jawline, and the angle is the same. And here, the shape of the ears and how they sit relative to the eyes, that's genetically determined and remarkably similar." He pulled back to show both faces side by side on the screen with the measurement overlays visible. "Sarah, these two women share significant facial structure similarities, more than would be expected from random chance." Sarah leaned closer, her mind racing through the implications. "Familial relationship almost certainly," James confirmed. "The degree of similarity in this many facial features strongly suggests they share close genetic heritage, sisters, possibly, or mother and daughter, though the age difference looks too small for that." Sarah felt a chill run through her. She had studied enough about the antebellum South to know exactly what this likely meant. White plantation owners routinely raped enslaved women, and the children born from that violence were themselves enslaved half-siblings to the white children of the household, but treated as property rather than family. "If they're sisters," Sarah said slowly, "that means Caroline Ashford's father raped an enslaved woman." James finished grimly, and then enslaved his own daughter. It wasn't uncommon. Historians estimate that a significant percentage of enslaved people in the antebellum South had white ancestry, usually through rape by enslavers. But to have photographic evidence this clear with facial structure, this is extraordinary documentation. Sarah stood and walked to her window, looking out at the Washington traffic below, trying to process what they were uncovering. The anonymous donor knew. That's why they said things aren't what they appear. This photograph wasn't just propaganda about the supposed benevolence of slavery. It was documentation of a white woman enslaving her own half-sister. "We need more evidence before and make that claim definitively," James cautioned. "Facial similarity is suggestive but not conclusive. We need historical records, birth records, plantation documents, family genealogies, and, ideally, if we can find living descendants, DNA analysis would be definitive." Sarah turned back to the photograph on the screen. The note mentioned an estate sale in Charleston 30 years ago, 1994. If this photograph came from the Ashford family estate, there might be other documents, letters, plantation records, family Bibles. We need to find out everything we can about Caroline Ashford and her family. James nodded, already typing notes into his laptop. "I'll start with Charleston historical records. The Ashford name should be well documented. Wealthy plantation families kept extensive records. And if Caroline lived past the Civil War, there will be census records, property documents, possibly even newspaper mentions. "What about Rachel?" Sarah asked. "Will we find anything about her?" And James's expression was somber. "That will be much harder. Enslaved people rarely appear in records under their own names before emancipation. But if she survived the war and lived into Reconstruction, there might be census records, Freedmen's Bureau documents, possibly church records if she was literate and active in the black community." Sarah returned to her desk and carefully photographed the carte de visite from multiple angles with her high-resolution camera, creating a complete digital archive. Then she turned the photo over and photographed the notation on the back. "Caroline Ashford and her girl Rachel," she read aloud. "Not even her servant or with her maid, just her girl." "The possessive language is so casual, so complete." "That was the point," James said. "The language reinforced the property relationship. Enslaved people weren't people. They were possessions like furniture or livestock." Sarah began searching historical databases while James continued his forensic analysis of the photograph. The Ashford name appeared immediately in Charleston records. A prominent family, wealthy plantation owners who had been in South Carolina since the early 1700s. "Found something," Sarah said. "Robert Ashford, plantation owner, born 1798, died 1865. He owned Ashford Grove Plantation, approximately 3,000 acres with over 200 enslaved people. He had one legitimate daughter, Caroline Ashford, born 1834. She married Thomas Peyton in 1856, but was widowed in 1862 when he died fighting for the Confederacy. She returned to her father's plantation, which is where she would have been in 1863 when this photograph was taken. So Caroline was about 28 or 29 in this photograph," James confirmed. "That matches the apparent age. What about siblings? Brothers or sisters?" "No legitimate siblings listed," Sarah said. "Caroline was an only child, at least officially." The word "officially" hung heavy in the air between them. They both knew what it meant. Robert Ashford may have had only one legitimate white child, but he almost certainly had other children born to enslaved women, children who were never acknowledged, never given his name, never granted inheritance or freedom, children like Rachel. For the next week, Sarah and James worked with obsessive focus, methodically building a documentary case about the Ashford family. They requested records from the South Carolina Department of Archives and History, the Charleston County Public Library's historical collection, and several university archives that held Civil War-era plantation documents. The Ashford family's history unfolded in meticulous detail. Robert Ashford had inherited the plantation from his father in 1825 and expanded it significantly, making a fortune from rice cultivation using enslaved labor. He was prominent in Charleston society, served in the state legislature, and was a vocal defender of slavery in the years leading up to the Civil War. And then they found a plantation inventory from 1850. It listed a woman named Sarah, age 23, as a house servant. Under her name was a notation, one child, female, age 3, named Rachel. Sarah calculated that Rachel would have been about 16 or 17 in 1863, younger than she appeared in the photograph. James explained that enslaved people's ages in these records were often approximate, and harsh living conditions often made them look older than their true age. Next, they found a plantation ledger from 1855 documenting clothing distribution. Most entries were routine, but next to Rachel's name was a handwritten note that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Give extra fabric this year. Master's orders. Girl looks like family. Keep her in house away from visitors. Oh my God," Sarah whispered. They knew. Robert Ashford knew Rachel looked like his legitimate family, and he specifically ordered her kept hidden from outside visitors who might notice the resemblance. James was already photographing the document. This is direct documentary evidence that Rachel's appearance was unusual enough to warrant special attention. Combined with the facial structure analysis, this strongly suggests she was Robert Ashford's biological daughter. Sarah felt rage building in her chestnut, the hot, impulsive anger of the moment, but the cold, sustained fury that came from documenting historical injustice in precise detail. Robert Ashford had raped an enslaved woman named Sarah. When their daughter Rachel was born, he enslaved his own child, and as Rachel grew and her resemblance to his white daughter Caroline became more apparent, he deliberately hid her away, knowing that her face revealed his crime. Rachel's mother died in 1860, according to a later inventory. No cause was listed. She had simply ceased to exist as far as the plantation's bookkeeping was concerned. Caroline's personal diary, found in a university archive, added another layer. An entry from January 1863 and read, "Father insists I have my portrait made with Rachel before he passes. He says it will show that our family treats our people with Christian kindness. I suppose he is right, though I find the whole affair tiresome. Rachel will need a decent dress for the photograph. I shall have my old blue silk altered to fit her." The photograph was Robert Ashford's dying wish, a final attempt to create a visual record that portrayed his enslavement of his own daughter as an act of kindness. Sarah returned to the photograph itself. The anonymous donor's note kept echoing in her mind. "Please examine it carefully. Some things are not what they appear." They had found the facial similarity, the historical records documenting Rachel's presence, even Caroline's diary entry about the photo session. But Sarah had a persistent feeling there was something else, some additional detail hidden in the image itself. She set up her professional scanner, a high-end flatbed model capable of capturing resolution and far beyond what the human eye could perceive, and carefully positioned the carte de visite. The scanning process took nearly 30 minutes at maximum settings, creating a massive digital file. When the scan was complete, Sarah loaded it onto her large monitor and began the painstaking process of examining every millimeter of the image at extreme magnification. She started with the background, the painted studio backdrop, the floor, the ornate side table. Nothing unusual. She moved to the clothing, examining fabric textures, buttons, lace details. Then she focused on Caroline's jewelry, a small brooch, a simple ring. Then Sarah moved to Rachel's side of the image. Rachel's hands were clasped in front of her waist, fingers interlaced. But as Sarah increased the magnification to the maximum, something caught her eye. Rachel's hands weren't simply clasped. They were positioned very deliberately, and she was holding something between her palms. Something small, mostly hidden by the careful bending of her fingers, but partially visible if you knew to look for it. Sarah's heart began to race. She adjusted the contrast and brightness, bringing out details that had been lost in shadow for 161 years. It was paper, a small piece of folded paper, no more than 2 inches square, clutched between Rachel's palms and deliberately concealed from casual observation. "James," Sarah called out, her voice tight with excitement. "You need to see this." James came to her side, and she showed him what she'd found. At normal viewing size, Rachel's hands appeared to be simply folded in the standard pose of a servant. But at extreme magnification, the hidden paper was undeniable. She was holding something during the photo session, James said, wonder in his voice. Something she deliberately hid from the photographer and from Caroline. Something small enough to conceal in her clasped hands. "The question is," Sarah said, "what was written on that paper? And more importantly, does it still exist?" James pulled up the anonymous donor's note on his phone and read it again. "Please examine it carefully. Some things are not what they appear." The donor knew about the paper, he said. "That's what they wanted you to find. Which means they might have the paper itself," James finished. "They might have found it with the photograph." Sarah looked at the small, partially visible corner of paper hidden in Rachel's hands 161 years ago. What had been so important that Rachel risked hiding it in a photograph that would be carefully examined and preserved by the family that enslaved her? A letter from a lover? A prayer? A record of her mother's death? Or something even more dangerous, something that named her father and named her enslaver? Sarah turned to James and said, "We need to find the donor. That paper could tell us Rachel's story in her own words. And after all these years, she deserves to be heard."